So I'm just going to throw out the questions if you want to move in a different direction.
Okay.
That's not
Sure.
not your
Yeah.
cup of tea. So as I wrote you, these are the questions I wrote to you. Said,
Okay.
do you think that the conventional Anglo-centric narrative of the Battle of the Alamo has functioned as a tool to impose a racial order?
Once I saw that question, I thought, oh my God. All right, give me a sec here. Okay, well, I do have thoughts about this, and so you can, I don't know if this is what you're looking for, but this is what
No, I am looking for what you've...
Yeah, exactly, okay. Okay, so the Battle of the Alamo, and more broadly, the Texas Revolution, has always been seen as this struggle between, say, half a dozen white guys and Santa Anna and his legions. It's a traditional heroic narrative which has been just almost remarkably enduring. And one of the reasons why it has endured so well, I think, is because in the last 25 years, when it became clear, we had this very Anglo-centric narrative that had been developed in the 20th century, and it was probably in need of change. What we needed to do was provide a more inclusive narrative. So in the 90s and the early years of the 21st century, what we did was insert people of color into that narrative. And what we did was not change that narrative at all. So people like Juan Seguin got a lot of attention because Juan Seguin had been a messenger from the Alamo and he had fought at the Battle of San Jacinto. And most seventh graders who study this period, when seventh graders study this period, they're taught about Juan Seguin at the Battle of San Jacinto. But what they are often not told is that Juan Seguin flees into exile 6 years later, just ahead of a lynch mob. And many other Tejanos had done exactly the same thing. And in fact, Juan Seguin figured out later more. How do I want to say that? Hold on. Juan Seguin, it's been a long day. Many prominent Tejano leaders had figured out, long before Juan Seguin did, that this new Texas Republic was not going to treat Tejanos equitably. And so Vicente Cordoba had figured that out. He had led the Cordoba Rebellion in 1838, 1839. Carlos de la Garza had been against the rebellion from the very beginning and had actually fought with the Mexican army in 1836. The Benavides family in Victoria had been forced into exile after supporting the rebellion in 1836. So Juan Seguin, you can point to Juan Seguin as sort of the poster child for Tejano loyalty, but that loyalty proved to be short-lived. And in fact, he's hardly representative of the Tejano community. To understand the Tejano community, I think you really need to get into the weeds. Some supported it, like Seguin, in part because Seguin had strong attachments to Stephen F. Austin. But many were ambivalent, and many others were decidedly opposed. And so if we just simply insert Juan Seguin into that narrative and then cut it off at the Battle of San Jacinto, then we're really doing a disservice to the complexity of the Tejano feelings toward white rule.
I wanted to say just along those lines, because you opened up a little bit of a segue when I interviewed Andres Tiarina in his backyard.
Oh, yeah. Hey, can I have that bottle of water?
And he made such a wonderful, presentations. And I was guilty of that, kind of seeing Tejanos as monoliths. Oh, I think I know what a Tejano is. And then, he really showed me the variety of Tejanos. And I think your new book, which we'll talk about in a minute, is so fluid. You talk about chaos and kind of anarchy and things shifting, constantly. You could be on this side one day and then you're on the other side out here.
Yeah.
You have mixed motives. I think one of the, the other aspects I thought was funny, and I think this had to do with Miguel, is kind of talk about pragmatism, how you could get Tejanos and you could get Anglos working together for pragmatic reasons, self-interest, and then those things could shift a little bit. Let me go to the...
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah, sure.
But the whole Tejano issue, and I'm not going to bring this up because I'm the only one who does this, and I know you don't want some outlier, but I don't use the term Tejano. I'm happy to use it. I don't really have a problem.
I listened to your speech today.
Everybody else uses it, okay?
Right.
But in the book, I use Hispano. And in the notes, I explain why I do. And the reason is because East Texas, Mexican Texans do not have anything in common with Bejareños. And Bejareños don't have much in common with the Victoria and Goliad. The people in Victoria and Goliad don't even get along. And people in San Antonio have connections to below the river. And so this idea of a Tejano identity makes no sense. They're Hispanos or Norteños, and after the Mexican-American War, then they're sort of cut off from their country of origin. And then they begin to sort of coalesce. They begin to develop an identity that has some meaning. They're not actually using the term Tejano. It's just, don't get me started.
I think being like an outlier is a positive thing. I think it's a good thing that, it shakes up, what people's ideas are, about
It's just another example of how complicated that Mexican society in Texas is.
Okay.
It's diverse.
All right. Was the Battle of the Alamo and the Mexican-American War part of a larger war that was inspired in part by the drive for slavery, the superiority of whites and their divine right to conquer lands?
Well, those are two separate things. One is slavery, and their divine right to conquer lands is another. And I don't subscribe to the view that this is all about slavery. And the reason I don't is because the rebellion, as I said earlier, rebellions tend to be ad hoc events. People are just mad. And they were mad for all sorts of reasons. Slavery becomes increasingly important in Texas, and by the time you get to annexation, then it frames the argument. That's all it's about. Annexing Texas will expand the slave empire. That's what makes it so controversial. But is the rebellion about slavery? I don't think so. Is the U.S.-Mexican War about slavery? It's really more about the acquisition of California, ports on the Pacific. And even Southerners, James K. Polk, of course, was the president during this period. He wanted ports on the Pacific. John Tyler, also a Southern ultra, as they say, someone who was very much attached to the slave empire, perpetuating the slave empire. He felt more strongly about ports in the Pacific. And we have this idea, this is probably not what you want to hear, we have this idea that Southerners can only do one thing, talk about slavery. They're not all John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun can only talk about one thing. He talks about slavery. But if you're John Tyler, you have a more expansive view of what the national interest is. So you're thinking about ports in the Pacific. Southerners could think in those terms. Not everyone could. But I think it's a little bit simplistic to say that Southerners are laser focused only on slavery in the 30s and the 40s. As time goes on, as the issue becomes more polarizing, then they do become more laser focused, it's true. But in the 30s and the 40s, the anti-slavery movement is still very much in its infancy. Great Britain had abolished slavery in 1833, and that's really when the radical anti-slavery movement in the United States begins. So opposition to slavery in the United States you see in the mid-30s, and it grows increasingly louder as time goes on. But initially, in the 1830s, I think it's a little bit simplistic to say that Southerners feel like a society under siege, and they absolutely have to expand slavery at all costs. That is not what you want to hear, I know, sorry.
I think that's incorrect, but anyway.
I thought.
No. I'm not saying I think you're incorrect in your assumption that that's not what I want to hear.
Oh, okay.
I'm very happy to hear.
It's just complicated. I know we have this idea of slavery. Slavery seems like a monomania to all slave holders, and it is a monomania to some, but not to all.
Okay.
That's all.
I think this kind of. It kind of is connected, it complements, and I'm thinking of Andrew Torget kind of here, and it's a general question.
Sure.
Again, I know it's cloudy and there's a lot of stuff, but collectively, what role did slavery and cotton production play in colonial and Republican Texas?
Wait a minute. In the colonial period or in the Texas Republic?
Play in both.
Oh, well, I mean, I think Andrew Torgett is exactly right. I mean, you don't have Anglo-Americans moving into Texas unless the institution of slavery is secure. So it's very, very important to them. And the Mexican government was willing to make allowances for that. There was increasingly opposition to the institution in Mexico, which had never really become entrenched. And but there was sort of a workaround. And I think Andrew's right, that they argued about slavery initially, and then after 1829, they started arguing about other things. Now, in the Republic of Texas, slavery becomes increasingly important. And the cotton economy is obviously what's fueling the growth of Texas in the late 30s. That sort of comes to a crashing halt in the early 1840s. But nonetheless, to understand Anglo-American immigration, to understand why Anglos are coming to Texas in such large numbers over a 20-year period, you need to understand you need to understand the institution of slavery, and you need to understand the plantation economy that he talks about.
Was the Panic of 1837 really crucial to the downfall, the price plummeting on cotton here?
The price plummets in 37. It takes a while for the panic to actually for its effects to be felt in Texas. So it's really more like 39, and then the early 40s, and they are finally coming out of it by the time you get to annexation. But it's obviously it throws everything into chaos. I don't think anybody would suggest, and I don't think Andrew would suggest, that you have a thriving plantation economy during the Republic period. It's an economy which is sort of finding its legs. By the 1850s, of course, after the U.S.-Mexico War, then the fastest growing population in Texas is the enslaved. Even with Anglo-Americans coming in, more people coming into Texas in the 1850s are of African descent. And that says something about how that plantation economy is becoming established after statehood.
Okay. In Contested Empire, you argued that it was the memories of the American Revolution of 1776 that shaped the behaviors of Anglo-Americans living west of the Sabine River. You argued that Americans rallied to the cause of Texas by viewing themselves through the prism and the legacy of George Washington and the Founding Fathers. Can you elaborate just a little bit on that?
Sure. So, okay, I will. Texans like to think about their revolution as being, and I'll start again. Texans like to think of their revolution as unique, and they like to think about Texas more broadly as being exceptional. And one of the things that they tend to forget is how important the American Revolution was to the events that take place in Texas in 1835 and 1836. Liberty or death were the watchwords of the American Revolution, and they became the watchwords of the Texas Revolution. Even the famous flag that we see flying over at the Battle of Gonzales, the Come and Take It flag, is a nod to their revolutionary forebears. In 1778, colonists in Georgia had issued that statement to the British Navy. And so we tend to forget over and over again how many times the American Revolution influenced the Texas Revolution. When Stephen F. Austin dies, for example, he is immediately anointed the father of Texas. And I would suggest one of the reasons is because the United States had a father of its country, and Texas needed a father as well, a patriarchal figure. And so Stephen F. Austin is anointed as that iconic figure, when in fact, Austin was never a Washington. He was never a military leader. As a political figure, I would suggest he becomes less and less relevant as the 1830s roll on. He is clearly the most important Anglo-American colonizer. We don't really have a problem with the title. But as time goes on, as Texas becomes more and more American, the man who was so concerned with building bridges between the Anglo community and the Mexican community, increasingly, his voice is increasingly disregarded as time goes on. So Washington is the father of his country. Austin is the father of his country, but I think the analogy doesn't work particularly well.
Okay. Traditionally, the narrative of the Battle of the Alamo and the Texas Revolutionary period is about white heroes fighting for liberty and freedom. You know, people such as William Barrett Travis, Sam Houston, Davy Crockett. But in your book, and this is something I really liked, you punctuate the region's unique multiracial character. Can you talk about the region's unique multiracial character?
Sure. Well, so when I wrote Unsettled Land, what I really wanted to do was reboot the conversation because the Alamo looms so large in the story of the Texas Revolution. Davy Crockett, who spent 9 weeks in Texas, he is the figure everybody seems to remember. And perhaps it might be a good idea to, if we're going to study Texas history, to talk about people who actually lived here for some length of time. And in fact, this was the most ethnically diverse region in North America, or one of the most ethnically diverse regions in North America. There was a Mexican population, there was an Anglo-American population, there was a European population, there were people of African descent, not just African Americans, but Yoruba-speaking Africans from the Niger River Delta. There were Indians coming in from the high plains following the buffalo. There were immigrant refugees from the United States, from the Great Lakes and from the Deep South. This fantastically diverse population. And all we talk about are half a dozen white guys at the gates of the Alamo. And so what I wanted to do in my book was to say, that's really a 20th century narrative. In the 21st century, we need to think a little bit more inclusively about everybody who lives here. And that's not just to say that I'm going to write that in those chapters on the Texas Revolution, I want to paint with a broad brush. There are Native Americans in 1835 and 1836 who do not give a damn about what's going on between Anglos and Mexicans. And I think we have an obligation as historians to look at the Indian world that exists separate and apart from an Anglo world. Everything that we do, everything that we have done in the last 100 years of scholarship on Texas has privileged Anglo-Americans, whether we are aware of it or not. When we use terms like Texians, for example, then we are somehow obscuring the fact that you have Anglo colonists and then you have Anglo-American mercenaries who arrived a few weeks earlier. And I think we need to explain the difference between the two.
I think that's one of the reasons I found your book so refreshing, and I was talking about it being kind of complementary. You know, I was talking to Ramon Vasquez at the Tapilam Nation and trying to find out what degree we want to be included. I hear a lot of indigenous people we want to be included. Tejanos, they're diverse stories that that want to be included. The things that get left out. I mean, that's one of the main reasons for wanting to do the documentary. Why? Another thing I would say, just to get a little politically, when I was talking about this idea of why 1836? We're talking about 13 days in 1836. What about 1718? If it's UNESCO World Heritage Site, it was not given to the Battle of the Alamo. What about those people that lived 10,000 to 14,000 years before that are not included in the story? And a lot of it is like you were talking about the poster child. I don't know, throw Juan Seguin in there. We got ourselves covered here. We got somebody who's
We haven't changed that narrative by inserting people of color. And I would suggest that we cannot shoehorn the narratives of people of color into that triumphalist narrative that you and I know so well. Mm-hmm. There are competing, and to be clear, I don't want to suggest that there's nothing wrong with the, let me start again. To be clear, I don't want to say that the triumphalist narrative needs to be completely dispensed with. If you are looking for martial heroism in the Texas Revolution, you're going to find it. But if you're looking for the subjugation of people of color, then you're going to find that too. And then to suggest that there's some kind of overarching narrative where all of the experiences of all of these people can be can be put together and tied up in a nice, neat bow, then I think we're kidding ourselves. These are competing narratives. The story of Texas in the early decades of the 19th century, the birth of early modern Texas, is a story of unremitting violence. And if that's the case, then it is impossible to fashion this kind of overarching, one-size-fits-all narrative.
Right.
And particularly when you are focusing and privileging only Anglo-American alpha males.
I want to ask you about a couple of the characters in your new book that were very interesting to me. You do talk a little bit about some of the well-known characters like a Sam Houston, but you have incorporated lesser-known characters, as you spoke today about Thomas Jefferson Green, Mary Maverick, and William Goyens. Why did you focus on an incorrigible self-promoter, a free person of color, and a diarist in your narrative?
Okay, so Thomas Jefferson Green, as I said today, really is emblematic of that entrepreneurial spirit that drives thousands of Americans into Texas. The desire to get rich, the desire to become famous, those are unique attributes of the Jacksonian male, the white Jacksonian male. And so I'm not just sort of picking someone who I think is obscure but might be fun to talk about. He's actually quite important. He leads the effort to prevent Santa Anna from leaving Texas on Velasco Beach in 1836. He leads an invasion, second in command of an invasion of Mexico in 1842. He's not a minor figure, but people like Houston and Austin have sucked all the oxygen out of the room. And I'm just trying to sort of provide just a more balanced portrait of these people. Now, William Goyens is an important figure in his own right. It's very difficult to piece together the lives of people of color, particularly people of African descent like William Goyens. But he did leave a record of lawsuits. As it happened, he was quite litigious. And you can go back through the court cases and tax rolls, and you can learn quite a lot about William Goyens, even though he doesn't keep a diary or very, very little correspondence. But he's, in addition to being a person of color, and therefore I felt that I needed to talk about someone who was, he's important in his own right simply because he is the negotiator between the white rebel government and then later the Houston administration, the first Houston administration, and the immigrant tribes. He has a relationship with Chief Bowles, the Cherokee leader in Indian country, and they rely on him over and over and over again. He is a person of color who is one of the most important diplomats in the first Houston administration. And therefore, I think he is deserving of our attention. In the case of Mary Maverick has a great diary where she talks about just the hardships and the travails of life for a white woman on the Anglo-American frontier. And in many ways, it's heartrending. She loses 4 children to disease in a very, very short span of time. It awakens in her a sense of, a very, very strong sense of, let me start again. Let me start again with her, okay? Mm-hmm. There are very few diaries written by Anglo-American women which really do present an accurate portrayal of what life would have been like for someone like Mary Maverick on the West Texas frontier. It is a terrific diary. What makes it even more interesting is that her descendants abridged the diary and published it. And I was under the impression that by reading the published version, I knew everything I needed to know about Mary Maverick until I got the diary itself and saw some of the things that had been taken out. And so you do have it does paint a picture of a woman who's traumatized by the loss of her children. At the same time, you also have someone who has some things, who says some things about the slaves that her family owns that we today would find very, very uncomfortable. She is shocked to learn that none of the people she owns loves her or like her enough to please her. And that's pretty much an exact quote. And we look at that today and we are sort of astonished, and we can't help but sort of snicker at at the fact that she actually believed that the people she owned would feel obligated to love her or to try to please her. She refers to herself as the slave of slaves. And this is in many ways consistent with what other historians of the American South have found, that slave-holding women, felt trapped in their own way. This was not an institution that she enjoyed or felt comfortable with. It was an institution that she was forced to accept. But she was, I think it's fair to say, a very unhappy person.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Mary Chestnut Boykin right here about, what ours is a miserable system.
Yeah, exactly.
That,
And Catherine Clinton's written about the same thing in Plantation Mistress.
Yeah. You argued that because the birth of early modern Texas was much a Mexican story as it was an American one, that you wanted to examine the roles of Lorenzo de Zavala and his protege, who you spoke today about, Jose Antonio. Why did you focus on those particularly?
Okay. I will say this. It's important to remember, this is a Mexican story. It starts off as a Mexican story, and it later becomes an American story. But to ignore the role that Mexicans play, that Mexican leaders play, in bringing Anglo immigrants into Texas, I think is a very, very big mistake. Lorenzo de Zavala is extremely important in promoting Anglo-American immigration, and as is Jose Antonio Mejia, his protege. I thought the story ended there, to be perfectly honest. But later, I realized how important Zavala was to the revolution itself. Zavala was mentioned once or twice today, and he is the most important figure in the Texas Revolution, and I'm not trying to be a contrarian. His relationship with Santa Anna goes back a decade, and when Zavala broke with the new centralist regime and broke with Santa Anna, he did so in a very, very public way. He was minister to Paris, published in the newspaper his letter saying, "You have torn the Constitution to pieces." Santa Anna recalled him, he refused to go, and he shows up in Texas in the summer of 1835. In the summer of 1835, Mexico City believes that Texas is going to be a beachhead of opposition. They know Zavala is there. They think Mejia and Farias are both coming, but they know Zavala is there. And all of the letters among Mexican officials between June and the outbreak of the revolution is about Zavala. And we've never asked ourselves, why does the Mexican government lead a major offensive into Texas in the first place? We've assumed that it's because of what Anglo-American colonists are doing. But this is another example of how we have made it all about us. Santa Anna did not know who William Barrett Travis was. He didn't know who William Wharton was, but he knew who Zavala was because they had been very, very close political allies and very close friends, and now bitter, bitter enemies. Why this offensive had been in the planning stages since the fall of 1835. It had nothing to do with the siege of San Antonio in December. It was already it wasn't on its way, but it was being organized in San Luis Potosí. Why does Santa Anna lead the expedition himself? If you understand anything about Santa Anna, is that he's really not an ideologue. He's motivated by these intensely personal relationships. He wants to bring Zavala home in irons. At the banks of the Brazos River, he learns that although Houston's army is to the north, the new Texas government is 50 miles to the east. Zavala is the vice president of the Texas Republic. Over and over in these books on the Texas Revolution, we're told he Santa Anna decides to go after the government, which is true. He's really going after Zavala. And if you want to understand why the invasion, I'm sorry, you cannot put that in there. It is not an invasion, okay? I slipped, because it's their own effing country, right? You can only call it an expedition or an offensive or something.
We stand corrected.
It's like Washington invading Pennsylvania during the Whiskey Rebellion, okay? It's sort of like that.
With
Okay.
Hamilton by his side.
I mean, it makes no sense.
Okay.
I can't, boy, it's been a long day. I can't believe I said that. I wanted to, all right, I was basically summarizing Zavala, and I think it's so important. If you want to understand why the Mexican offensive takes place, then you need to look at the relationship between Santa Anna and Zavala. If you want to understand why Santa Anna divides his forces at the Brazos River and goes after the government instead of Houston's army, you have to understand the relationship between Zavala and Santa Anna. And we have made this story all about us. And that's the mistake. This is a Mexican story.
You know, in some ways, I think what you just said there is profound, because if, all the literature I've looked at, all of the books, I mean, that is often just totally forgotten. It's not, it's everything done, by white people,
Yeah,
the fight
yeah.
for liberty and freedom, not understanding the alliances between Tejanos and the Anglos and what I have to say with Tiarina, I learned so much about again, collectively, Tejano contributions.
Yeah, Tina Arena's stuff on the valley is great.
Oh, I mean,
the ranching economy.
Oh yeah, he was
And
talking
goes
about
into those
water
18th century
rights and land
grants.
rights and
That's really, really important.
contributions. I mean, he was on fire. He
Yeah,
was
there you go.
absolutely,
Okay,
he
great,
was
thanks.
on fire. I wanted to ask, I'm getting very close out here, but asking about these two gentlemen that we were talking about here, Zavala and focusing on Mejia out there. Did they unwittingly pave the way for the loss of Mexico's northern territory?
They did. Zavala and Mejia were both responsible for paving the way for Anglo-American immigration and bringing about the dismemberment of Mexico, the loss of Mexico's northern territories. They deal with that differently. Mejia will wash his hands of the rebellion, and he goes to New Orleans and has nothing more to do with the Texas Rebellion after 1835. He will continue to fight for Mexican federalism, and he will die leading a revolt against the government in 1839. Zavala, and you need to know something about Zavala to understand why he's okay with it. Zavala had always been someone who loved the United States, who had studied the great writers like Jefferson and others. Was a great student of American history. His wife was American. His son was educated in the United States. He made his fortune working with Anglo-American land speculators. And so he takes it is so clear that after 1836, Texas is going to be an independent nation. Many Mexicans were, I think, felt a real sense of guilt about what had happened. And Zavala did not. Zavala signed the Declaration of Independence, and I think we can take him at his word, signed it without a moment's hesitation. The other two, Navarro and Ruiz, were considerably more reluctant to do so, but not Zavala. And if you understand who Zavala is, then it makes a little bit more sense. This idea of a Mexican nation state was really more of an idea than a thing. Okay, this notion of Mexican territorial sovereignty meant less to him than what it meant to be a Mexican. So for some people, Mexicanidad is only understood in terms of territorial sovereignty, and he understood it very, very differently. And both Zavala and Austin, they have a lot in common. They're both transnational in their orientation. Why can't we all get along? Austin's building bridges between Anglos and the Mexican officialdom. Zavala is also encouraging Anglo-American settlers, but they are outliers. in the sense that this notion of a transnational identity of North American Republican states is never really going to work. And so that's why Zavala is reviled by Mexicans and ignored by Americans. And Stephen F. Austin, I would suggest, becomes less and less relevant as Texas becomes more and more American. Most people just didn't think like Zavala and Austin. We can study them, we can appreciate them, but we need to understand that they are outliers.
Okay. I'm winding down here.
Okay.
I can see you're very tired here. One of the most tragic episodes in your book is the plight of the Cherokee quest for a permanent homeland in East Texas. Can you just give us a broad summary here?
So, all right. One of the saddest stories in the book is the quest for a Cherokee homeland, and something that I talk about in chapter 1. As early as 1822, they are asking the governor of Texas to give them land in East Texas and to give them legal title to that land. The plight of the Cherokee is one of the most heartrending stories in the birth of early modern Texas. As early as 1822, the Cherokees are asking for legal title to a permanent homeland in the piney woods of East Texas. The Mexican bureaucracy drags its feet, very often well-intentioned, but nonetheless, the political instability in Mexico is such that by the time you get to 1835, many, many years after they had first petitioned the Mexican government, nothing has actually been done. And they come so close so many times. In 1832, they almost succeeded. But the man who had the power to give them their land, Mieri Tehran, committed suicide. And so by 1835, the rebellion has broken out, and promises by the Mexican government have never, ever been fulfilled. And so they have a choice. They can either remain loyal to the Mexican government, or they can sign a treaty with the new rebel government, which, and one of the leaders of the rebel government, and of course, soon to be president, is Sam Houston, someone who knew the Cherokees well, who had lived among the Cherokees. They knew many of the same people. They believed they could trust Houston. And so they signed a treaty to remain neutral during the rebellion. Had they joined the Mexican side, the revolution could very well have ended very differently. But they honor their terms of the agreement. The rebel government says, we will give you an Indian homeland in East Texas if you remain neutral. They did. It was not pointed out to them that it had to be ratified by the new, by the government, by the Texas Senate, and the Senate rejected the treaty. And unfortunately, the Cherokees, who had begged the Mexican government to give them land time and time and time again, when they turned to the Americans, also found that their petitions fell on deaf ears. And by the time you get to 1839, only 3 years after they had signed that treaty, Mirabeau Lamar, the new president at that time,
inveterate Indian hater,
Houston's successor, who has no intention of allowing the Indians to remain there. And everybody in America who knows their American history knows about the Trail of Tears. Trail of Tears is going on in the winter of 1839. A far more violent expulsion of Indians is taking place in Texas. In Texas, unlike the United States, the assumption was by Mirabeau Lamar and others that Indians had no claim to any land whatsoever. The United States had signed the Treaty of New Echota and other treaties. It had been signing treaties with the Indians since the Washington administration. Signing treaties to expel them from their land, I mean, let's be honest. But in Texas, the view of the administration was, and the Lamar administration was, they had no right to that territory and deserved no compensation for the land that they had occupied for decades.
Final question.
Okay.
I just want to ask you, what would you like people, students, professors, such as myself, the general book, what would you like them to take away from your book?
Okay, so what I wanted to do was change the conversation. That we think of the Texas Revolution as a revolution between a small group of white alpha males against Santa Anna's legions. Texas is a diverse place. We need to understand it in all of its full complexity. It is no less rich for our understanding of the complexity of that story. That's one thing that I wanted to do. The other thing is that we, to use a historian's term, we periodize the revolution in a way that sort of ends with a blast of trumpets and a crash of cymbals with Houston's victory at San Jacinto. I try to make the case in the book that if we really want to argue that it's a revolution, we need to understand all of the people that it touches. And that turmoil has only just begun. And you have a shift from a multiracial society, Mexico, which is not a colorblind society. Let's be clear about that. But it is a multiracial society. The dramatic, rapid shift from a multiracial society to white rule with the Lone Star Republic. And so if it's a revolution for many people other than Anglo-Americans. And the people of African descent, Native Americans, Mexican Texans, they were all disadvantaged as those racial boundaries, those racial lines snapped taut during the Texas Republic.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I really, really enjoyed that.
Okay.
You've given me a lot of different perspectives.